Ma'am, I need to ask you something directly. Is this woman forcing you to be here with her?
Forcing me, she's my daughter.
Your daughter?
Yes, my daughter. Now, will you please leave us to our breakfast?
Officer, is there a problem? I'm just spending time with my mom.
Ma'am, with all due respect, I'm going to need you to let her speak for herself.
Mom, it's okay. Just breathe.
Ma'am, I need you to stand up.
Officer Eric Moore, 41 years old, 7 months into his tenure at the Hardinville Police Department, walked into the Silver Spoon Diner on a Saturday morning, saw a black woman sitting across from a white-haired elderly woman, and arrived at a conclusion before he reached their table. He had no call, no complaint, no signal of distress from the older woman, not a glance, not a gesture, not a single word directed at anyone but her companion. Just a black woman, a white senior, and a story he'd already decided was true. He approached the table, positioned himself between them, and proceeded to question the elderly woman as though the black woman sitting across from her was not there. When that woman attempted to intervene, he dismissed her. When diner staff stepped forward to vouch for them, he dismissed them too. When she produced her identification, he called it a forgery. And when she refused to leave her mother, her panicked, trembling 79-year-old mother, he put her in handcuffs. What Officer Eric Moore did not know was that the woman he pressed against the breakfast counter in front of 30 recording phones in a diner full of witnesses was a sitting Superior Court judge with 18 years on the bench, and that his decision to treat a black daughter like a criminal on an ordinary Saturday morning over French toast would cost him his badge, his career, his certification, and the city of Hardinville $2.2 million. Before we go further, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. We love knowing who's in the room with us. And if you believe a black woman having breakfast with her mother should never be treated as a crime scene, like this video and subscribe. The Silver Spoon on a Saturday morning sounds exactly the way a place should sound when nothing is wrong. The low percussion of ceramic mugs being set on laminate, the hiss of the milk steamer, the overlapping comfortable murmur of people who have nowhere to be and no reason to hurry. And in the corner booth, the one by the window, the one that had quietly over the years become their booth, sat Elena Greyson, 45 years old, reading glasses she didn't need yet resting on the table beside her coffee. Watching her mother, Mary, attempt to construct the most structurally ambitious tower of whipped cream a Belgian waffle had ever been asked to support, she was letting her mother win. Donna, their waitress, who had worked the Silver Spoon for 11 years and could have recited the Greyson order from memory in her sleep, had already brought Elena's black coffee and Mary's chamomile without being asked. She'd done it the moment she saw them come through the door, the way she always did, with the ease of someone recognizing not just a face, but a Saturday. She knew the booth, she knew the order, she knew the way Elena always let her mother decide on dessert first, and then looked up at Donna with that quiet, patient expression that said, whatever makes her happy. Elena Greyson had spent 18 years as a Superior Court judge in this county. 18 years of presiding over cases that carried the full, complicated weight of human lives, custody battles, civil rights violations, wrongful convictions overturned on evidence she'd reviewed herself at midnight. She had sat across from attorneys who underestimated her once, and precisely once. She had developed the particular kind of stillness that comes only from being the most powerful person in a room and choosing, deliberately, not to announce it. Measured, unhurried. A woman who had learned that the truth, stated clearly, is always enough. But none of that was what this Saturday was about. This Saturday was about her mother's 81st birthday approaching and the French toast that Mary had ordered every week since Elena was a teenager, and the particular way Mary laughed, sudden and unguarded, the laugh of a woman who had decided long ago that joy was not something to ration. This was about 30 years of Saturday mornings. About the fact that Elena's father, Robert Greyson, had brought both of them here for the first time in 1987 to the same corner, in what was then a different diner with a different name and the same cracked linoleum, and that they had kept coming back, through his illness, through his passing, through Elena's law school years and her first appointment, and every hard thing in between, because some rituals are not habits. They are promises you keep to the people you love. That was the morning Officer Eric Moore walked through the door. Moore did not look at Elena when he approached the table. That was the first tell. He pulled up beside their booth, angled his body toward Mary, and addressed her the way someone might speak to a person they believed had forgotten they were in danger. Slowly, with exaggerated gentleness, like the kind that isn't actually gentle at all. "Ma'am," he said, "I just want to make sure you're all right. Is everything okay here?" Mary looked up from her waffle, mildly puzzled, and said that yes, everything was fine. Moore nodded as though he had heard something different. He asked again, slightly rephrased, whether she felt comfortable, whether she was here by choice. Mary said of course she was. Moore's eyes moved to Elena for exactly 1 second and then returned to Mary, which told Elena everything she needed to understand about what was happening. This is a pattern that has been documented in policing research and civil rights litigation for decades. It is called targeted witness isolation, the practice of directing all questions to one party in order to implicitly discredit the other before they have spoken a single word. Now, by speaking only to Mary, Moore was not gathering information. He was constructing a narrative. He was positioning Elena as a subject rather than a participant, a presence to be investigated rather than a person to be addressed. And he was doing it because the image in front of him, a black woman, an elderly white woman, a diner booth, had already resolved itself in his mind into something that required his intervention. Elena set down her coffee cup. She did not raise her voice. She did not stand. She folded her hands on the table with the practiced composure of someone who had spent nearly 2 decades controlling the temperature of far more volatile rooms than this one. "Officer," she said, "my name is Elena Greyson. I'm a sitting Superior Court judge for this county. This woman is my mother. I can show you my judicial identification if that would be helpful, but I'd also ask that you tell me what exactly prompted this approach, because there is no distress here, and there was no complaint." She reached into her bag and produced her credentials, the kind of identification that is not easy to fake, with a court seal, a judicial commission number, and her photograph in official capacity. She placed it on the table in front of him. Moore picked it up. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he set it back down and said it could be a forgery. This is what confirmation bias looks like when it has a badge. It is not stupidity. It is something more insidious, the mind's refusal to update in the presence of contradicting evidence because the original conclusion feels, to the person holding it, more true than the facts. Psychologists call this belief perseverance. In a civilian, it is an unfortunate cognitive flaw. In a law enforcement officer with arrest authority, it becomes a constitutional violation in real time. The Fourth Amendment does not permit detention based on the persistence of a bias. It requires objective, articulable facts. Moore had none. He had a feeling. And rather than release the feeling, he tried to disqualify the evidence. Donna, who had been watching from behind the counter with her hand resting on the coffee pot she had stopped refilling, walked over. She told Moore plainly that she'd been serving these 2 women every Saturday for years, that Mary was Elena's mother, and that she didn't know what he thought he was seeing, but she could tell him what she actually saw every week. 2 regulars, a table by the window, were French toast and chamomile. A few of the other Saturday morning regulars began to murmur in agreement. One older gentleman in a flannel shirt, who sat at the counter every week without exception, turned on his stool and said he knew this family. Moore thanked them for their concern and told them this didn't involve them. It was around this point that Mary's hands began to tremble. She was 79 years old, with a heart that her cardiologist monitored twice a year, and she was watching a uniformed officer interrogate her daughter over a breakfast they had been sharing together since before Elena passed the bar. The trembling was slight at first, her coffee cup rattling gently in its saucer. Then her breathing changed, shallower, quicker. Elena saw it immediately and shifted her full attention to her mother, reaching across the table, or speaking softly, telling her it was going to be fine. Moore saw the shift in Elena's attention and read it as deflection. He stepped closer and told her to keep her focus on him. He was not, in that moment, capable of imagining that the most important thing happening at that table had nothing to do with him at all. Moore told Elena to stand up. He said it the way men say things when they have already decided that what comes next is not a negotiation. Flat, final, with the particular authority of someone who has confused the power to compel with the right to. Elena looked at her mother, whose hands were now pressed flat against the table, whose breathing had become the shallow, effortful kind that Elena recognized and feared. She told Moore, calmly and clearly, that her mother was showing signs of cardiac distress and that she was not going to step away from her until she was certain she was stable. She was not defiant. She was not aggressive. She was a daughter making a medically reasonable decision in real time, stated plainly, with her reasons given. Moore reached across the booth and grabbed her by the arm. What happened next took less than 30 seconds and will take the rest of this chapter to fully account for, because the law that was broken in those 30 seconds had been written in blood and litigation across more than 2 centuries of American history, and it deserves to be named properly. The Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits unreasonable seizure of a person. Seizure, in legal terms, occurs the moment a reasonable person would not feel free to leave. While Moore had crossed that threshold several minutes earlier. The physical grab, the forced removal of Elena Greyson from her seat, the spin toward the counter, the click of handcuffs closing around the wrists of a sitting Superior Court judge, was not the beginning of the constitutional violation. It was the visible peak of one that had been building since he walked through the door with a conclusion already formed. The diner went completely silent. Not the gradual quiet of a room losing interest in itself, but the sudden, total silence of 30 people witnessing something that didn't make sense and made perfect sense at the same time. Plates stopped moving, forks were set down, and then, almost in unison, the phones came up, held out from booths and counter stools in the waitress station, recording from every angle. The way people now instinctively document what they know should not be happening and suspect no one will believe without proof. Mary made a sound that Elena would describe, months later in a deposition, as the worst sound she had ever heard in her life. It was a sharp, fractured intake of breath, the sound of a 79-year-old woman watching her child be handcuffed over French toast on a Saturday morning, and it carried across the silent diner like something breaking. Elena, pinned against the counter, turned her head toward her mother and said steadily, "Mom, look at me. I'm right here. I'm okay." She said it the way she had once talked Mary through a health scare in a hospital corridor, and the way Mary had once talked her through the fear of her first courtroom. Back and forth across a lifetime. This was how they had always handled the unbearable, by holding the other person's gaze. Moore keyed his radio. He reported a code 207, abduction and elder abuse in progress, and gave the address of the Silver Spoon with the brisk satisfaction of a man who believed he had just prevented a crime. The room listened to every word. Several people were already crying. Donna had both hands over her mouth. The man in the flannel shirt had his phone out with the screen facing directly at Moore. Sergeant David Miller arrived 11 minutes later. He was a 22-year veteran who had spent the better part of the last decade cycling in and out of Judge Greyson's courtroom as a testifying officer. He had stood in her court on a combined 41 occasions, homicide cases, civil rights hearings, use of force reviews. He knew her judicial voice, her courtroom demeanor, knew the specific quality of her attention when she was deciding whether testimony was credible. He walked into the Silver Spoon, expecting a disturbance call, and what he saw instead was Elena Greyson in handcuffs against a breakfast counter, while an elderly woman wept in a corner booth. The color left his face so completely and so immediately that Donna would later say it looked like someone had pulled a plug. "Release her," Miller said. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. "Release her right now," Moore began to explain. Miller cut him off with a single raised hand and said, with the careful enunciation of a man trying to control something rising fast inside him, "That is a Superior Court judge. Take those off her. Now." The handcuffs came off. Miller turned to Elena and said, "Your Honor," in a voice that carried the full weight of what those 2 words meant in this particular moment, with this particular woman standing in this particular diner. He apologized. He told her he would stay with her mother until medical assistance arrived if she needed it. He was already reaching for his radio with his other hand. Moore stood slightly behind him, his face cycling through expressions in the way faces do when a person's internal story collapses faster than they can build a new one. Defensive first, then confused, then something that looked to everyone watching like the first cold contact with consequence. The city's first public response came 48 hours after the incident, are in the form of a 3-paragraph statement released on a Sunday afternoon, the communications equivalent of burying something in a backyard. It expressed that the department took all allegations of misconduct seriously, that the matter was under internal review, and that the city remained committed to fair and equitable policing for all residents. It did not name Officer Moore. It did not acknowledge Judge Greyson by title. It did not use the word apology. It was written, as these statements almost always are, not to inform the public, but to create a paper record of institutional concern while admitting nothing that could be held against the city in the litigation that everyone in the room already knew was coming. This is standard crisis management. It is also, from a legal standpoint, largely useless when 30 people have phone footage. Elena's attorneys filed a federal civil rights lawsuit 9 days later. The claims were precise and layered in the way that effective civil rights litigation has to be, not a single broad accusation, but a structured argument built on specific constitutional and statutory violations, each one documented and each one carrying its own category of damages. The primary claim was a Fourth Amendment violation. Unlawful seizure without probable cause, without reasonable suspicion, without any articulable fact that would justify the detention of a private citizen, let alone the physical arrest of one. The Fourth Amendment does not permit a police officer to act on instinct shaped by racial assumption. It requires objective facts observable to any reasonable person. Moore's own incident report, filed the evening of the arrest, described Elena as agitated, uncooperative, and aggressive toward the reporting officer. The attorneys obtained the diner footage within 72 hours, all 12 angles of it. What the footage showed was a woman who did not raise her voice once. Forensic video analysts reviewed the recordings frame by frame and produced a report that described Elena's movements throughout the encounter as consistently measured and non-threatening, her posture as defensive rather than aggressive, and her physical responses as consistent with a person attempting to de-escalate rather than provoke. The report noted that at no point did she make any movement toward Moore that could reasonably be interpreted as threatening, and that her only sustained physical action during the encounter was turning toward her mother. Moore's incident report, placed beside the video analysis, did not describe a different interpretation of the same events. It described a different event entirely. That discrepancy between what an officer writes and what a camera records is one of the most consequential fault lines in modern policing accountability, and it is precisely why documentation by witnesses is not a nuisance to law enforcement, but a necessary check on a system that has historically had the power to write its own history. The second layer of the lawsuit was false arrest. False arrest in federal civil rights law is not merely an incorrect arrest. It is an arrest made without probable cause, which transforms a law enforcement action into an unlawful seizure of a person. Elena had committed no crime. She had been accused of none. The Code 207 Moore radioed in was not supported by a single observable fact that would have held up in the courtroom of any judge in any jurisdiction, including the jurisdiction over which Elena herself presided. The third claim was intentional infliction of emotional distress on a senior citizen, and this one carried its own particular weight. Mary Greyson was 79 years old. She had a documented cardiac history. She had been subjected, without cause, to a prolonged and frightening confrontation that ended with her daughter being handcuffed in front of her. Her treating physician submitted an affidavit connecting the acute anxiety episode she experienced that morning to a subsequent health event that required monitoring. The law recognizes that harm is not always visible. Sometimes it lives in a heartbeat that was never quite the same afterward. And then the investigators found Moore's personnel history. He was what the department had classified internally as a lateral hire, an officer who had not come up through their academy but had transferred in from another jurisdiction, bringing his certification and his record with him. Except the record that transferred was not the complete one. Discovery compelled the release of employment files from Moore's 2 previous departments. In both, there were documented complaints of racially motivated stops and detentions. In both, The complaints had been reviewed, flagged, and then quietly resolved without termination, the institutional equivalent of moving a problem sideways rather than addressing it. No one had looked at the pattern across departments because no one had been required to look. Lateral hires existed in part in the gap between what one department documented and what the next one asked. The city had hired him without requesting his full disciplinary history. That omission had a price, and the invoice was now in the hands of a federal court. The city settled in 91 days. That speed is itself a form of information. When a municipality moves that quickly to resolve a federal civil rights lawsuit, it is not because they have experienced a sudden moral awakening. It is because their attorneys have reviewed the evidence and concluded that the cost of proceeding to trial exceeds the cost of writing a check. In this case, the calculation was not complicated. 12 angles of video footage, a judicial plaintiff, a 79-year-old woman with a documented cardiac event, a lateral hire whose prior disciplinary record the city had failed to obtain. Any one of those elements would have given a jury pause. Together, they pointed toward a verdict that would have dwarfed what the city ultimately agreed to pay. The $2.2 million settlement was not generosity. It was arithmetic. It is worth understanding what that number represents in legal terms, because civil rights settlements are not arbitrary figures. They are constructed from specific categories of harm, each one requiring documentation and argument. Elena's claim included compensation for the unlawful seizure itself, for the reputational harm inflicted on a sitting judicial officer, and for the emotional distress of the arrest and its aftermath. Mary's portion accounted for the acute psychological trauma she experienced, the subsequent health complications her physicians connected to that morning, and what the law calls loss of enjoyment of life, the measurable diminishment of a person's capacity to experience their days without fear or distress. The combined figure also carried a punitive dimension, reflecting the city's institutional negligence in hiring more without proper vetting. Punitive damages exist not to compensate victims, but to cost institutions enough that indifference becomes more expensive than diligence. BD for wrongfully. $2.2 million was the price Hardenville paid for a background check it chose not to run. Moore was terminated within 30 days of the lawsuit filing. More significantly, he was stripped of his peace officer certification by the state licensing board, a consequence that receives less public attention than it deserves. Termination alone means very little in a profession where officers routinely move between jurisdictions the way Moore himself had done. Decertification is the mechanism that closes that door. It removes the credential that makes employment in law enforcement possible anywhere in the state, and it creates a permanent record in the National Law Enforcement Officer Misconduct Database that other jurisdictions are required, though not always diligent, to consult. Moore could not transfer. Then he could not reapply. The career he had used as a vehicle for his bias was over in every direction. The structural reform that came out of the settlement was, in some ways, its most durable consequence. As a condition of resolution, the city was required to implement what the consent agreement formally called the Hardenville Officer Hiring Integrity Standards, though it became known publicly, and almost immediately, as the Greyson Protocol. It mandated that all lateral hire candidates undergo a complete review of disciplinary records from every prior employing jurisdiction before an offer could be extended. It required that bias-related complaints be evaluated not in isolation, but as a pattern across a candidate's full employment history. It established annual, audited implicit bias training for all active officers, not the checkbox variety that departments have used for years to satisfy requirements without producing change, but structured, scenario-based training with pre- and post-assessments and results reported to an independent oversight body. Other departments in the state began adopting versions of it within 18 months. The Morning and the Silver Spoon had produced, through its very ugliness, a policy framework designed to prevent its own repetition. Elena used a portion of her settlement to establish the Grayson Wells Foundation, named for her mother's maiden name, dedicated to legal advocacy and mental health support for elderly victims of profiling and civil rights violations. She had watched her mother spend months working through the particular fear that settles into a person after they have witnessed something they cannot undo. And she understood that the legal remedy and the human remedy are not the same thing, and that both are necessary. Mary, for her part, insisted on going back. 1 year after the arrest, on a Saturday morning in October, Elena pulled open the door of the Silver Spoon and held it for her mother, who walked in with the deliberate steadiness of a woman who has decided that a place belongs to her. Donna was behind the counter. She looked up, and her face did the thing it does when something you've been waiting for finally arrives. She didn't say anything. She just walked over to the corner booth by the window and removed the small laminated reserved sign from the table, replacing it with one she had made herself, laminated at the copy shop 2 blocks away, that read simply, "Greyson Family." Mary sat down. She picked up the menu she didn't need. She ordered the French toast. Some things are reclaimed not through courtrooms or settlements or protocols, but through the quiet, undefeated act of showing up again in the same booth with the same order on the same morning of the week and refusing to let someone else's failure of imagination become the last word on who you are and where you belong. Thank you for staying until the end. That means more than you know. If there is one thing this story asks you to carry with you, let it be this. A badge is not a license to rewrite what is plainly in front of you. Bias dressed in authority is still bias. And as Mary Greyson proved on a quiet Saturday morning over French toast, dignity is not something that can be handcuffed. It waits. And eventually, it wins. If this story moved you, if it educated you, if it made you think, share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Recommend it to a friend, a parent, a young person who is just learning how the world works and deserves to know the truth about it. Subscribe if you haven't already, because this channel exists to tell the stories that matter, and we can only keep doing that with you in the room. We'll be back tomorrow with another story you won't want to miss, and while you're waiting, our previous video is on your screen right now. Go watch it. We think you'll want to. See you tomorrow.